I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm the founder of the Transparency Task Force. The Transparency Task Force is a certified social enterprise, which simply means that we exist to make an impact and not to make a profit. Our mission is to promote ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. And that's a mission we take very seriously. We've frankly worked very hard to try to make a difference. And our attempts to make a difference often revolve around the strategy of bringing like-minded people together to contribute to challenging some of the issues that are out there. And today's event is a really good example of that. This really has been a wonderful team effort between WILPF, between the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, and also United Nations Association UK. I'm going to invite Ben just very briefly to introduce himself and say just one or two things about United Nations Association UK. Then we'll go quickly to Tanielle, who'll introduce herself and share some further thoughts as well. So Ben, over to you, please, first of all. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andy, and thank you everyone for joining us at today's event. The United Nations Association UK, so we're a charity, and we're a UK charity, and we're working for a strong, credible and effective United Nations. And we see this issue of lethal autonomous weapon systems as super important. It's been identified by the UN Secretary General as a major concern for international peace and security. He's termed these things morally repugnant and asked states to work for a ban as fast as possible. We're also seeing this huge boom in spending in AI. So there's this growing sort of dual concern about this that I hope that today's event will go into in a bit more detail. Thanks so much for all your work, Andy, in terms of hosting us today, and to all the speakers, and really look forward to a great discussion.
Thank you, Ben. And just before we quickly go to Tanielle, I'll share my screen, if I may, for just one moment to share one slide on a matter that I think is pretty significant. So this slide is from the Edelman Trust Barometer. For those of you that don't know, the Edelman Trust Barometer is a highly respected annual exercise to measure the levels of trust in different parts of the system. And what this slide shows, very disappointingly, is that the financial sector is the second least trusted of all industries, second only to social media. And the reason I'm mentioning this, folks, is because we at the Transparency Task Force believe quite passionately that for the financial services sector to behave the way that it needs to for society's service, it really does need to be far more transparent, particularly in relation to the investments that people unwittingly hold. We're very concerned that illicit money flows may be finding their way into portfolios that they shouldn't be anywhere near. Today's topic is a huge topic of such importance that we really do want to revisit this time after time and really create a sense of momentum around the idea of galvanizing support and driving change through all kinds of stakeholders, parliamentary, the media, civil society groups, campaign groups, activists, and so on. I'm absolutely sure this is one of those unifying missions that we can all really get behind. And today's event, frankly, has been inspired by Tanielle. Her energy and passion for the causes that she supports has really energized me, and everything kicked off as a direct consequence of Tanielle's passion for these issues. So Tanielle, please now take the opportunity to introduce yourself and cover the points you wish to. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for all the hard work you put into this. And it was actually Violation Tracker that helped with some of the research for the tech paper that I produced for the tech developers group for the UK Campaign to Stop Killer Robots, which I'll flash up on the screen, and showed how many fines there were for things like bias, algorithmic bias and such, which shows how much power and how flawed some of the technology is, which I'll go into. And if it's possible, may I have a screen share so I can flash up some slides?
Yeah, you should be able to go straight into that. While Tanielle's doing that, I'm going to just talk a bit more about Violation Tracker. I'll pop a link into the chat regarding Violation Tracker. For those of you that don't know, Violation Tracker is a United States database that we have successfully brought to the UK. working with and supporting the people in Washington, DC who build and run the database. I'll touch on a bit more about it later. It's got all sorts of useful information in there about anti-money laundering breaches, about bribery breaches, accounting fraud, all kinds of things. It's a real treasure chest for campaigners and researchers and parliamentarians to use. Tanya, over to you. We can see your slides now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry for that faffing. So I've put up here a quote from Elon Musk, who is one of the many silent scientists and tech company proprietors who has signed the Future of Life pledge, which is not to build or participate in technology contribution which creates autonomous weapons. And this is a quote from him, which basically says that there has to be regulation on the technology and laws, international laws regulating it, because it's not the kind of thing that you can regulate afterwards. And I will share these slides afterwards because I'm going to whiz through quite quickly and I know how frustrating that can be. But I don't have a lot of allotted time because there are far better speakers than me to come. And I've just put some of the law on there, the Geneva Convention laws, which suggest why these are so illegal or could be so illegal. So for instance, we have laws against laws against discrimination and laws that say that we need distinction. You need to be able to discriminate. There are laws against indiscriminate harm and disproportionate harm. And there is a precaution need that states are, it's incumbent upon states to take precautions to spare civilian populations and objects. And of course, this requires the ability to distinguish between them. And we know that algorithms simply can't do that. For example, order combat, which is Article 3, which requires discrimination and adverse distinction. The technology simply can't distinguish between a civilian and a combatant, but more so a combatant who has surrendered, an injured combatant, combatants in sea. So these are the kinds of details of distinction which the scientific community and the tech community have been crying out for over a decade to say the technology simply isn't there. And even though it will improve to a point, there is a fundamental part of the complexity of the technology and unpredictability of the technology, which in command of control, due to the tracking, the surveillance, it simply cannot have that kind of control beyond the ethics of the lack of a human being in the loop. I put some legal precedent on here, which I'll let you look at in detail afterwards. But one of the most important things here, under the Chemical Weapons Convention, Mine Ban Treaty, Convention on Cluster Munitions Ban, they prohibit the use, development, production, acquisition, stockpiling, retention, transfer, and assistance with those prohibited activities. And assistance, there is legal precedent to define assistance as financial assistance as well, and that's really key for us here today. I've put up here just a broad list, it's not remotely exhaustive, of some of the tech, the dual use technology that can contribute. So we've got everything from the broad machine learning and neural networks, but things like sensors from heat, live streaming body cams, facial recognition, data fusion, data target tracking. And these, it must be remembered, can contribute to really positive things like fire departments being able to see through smoke-filled buildings because they're looking for the injured, they're looking for bodies, they're looking to help, they're looking to look at where the fires are to put them out. But then you can see how that might be used in a combat situation in a civilian built-up area. Now, the problem for us as investors, as asset managers, and as the public, where you might be talking about your pension fund, where you might be talking about public funds, where you might be talking about industries who are funding and sponsoring, say, all-party parliamentary groups, or perhaps maybe sponsoring a non-executive director who may also be in politics, is that some of this technology may be touted as we only look at this positive outcome, but it may have an unintended or a non-publicized unintended use, which is not something that the people working on the technology actually want it to be used for, and it's not something that those investing in it want it to be used for. So that makes it deeply problematic, not controlled, and highly undemocratic. So we can talk about sort of illicit tax flows, or illicit cash flows rather, but what we're really deeply concerned about is those sort of legal cash uses which go to maluse and maladaptive technologies which we don't know they're being used for. So we've actually got some lawyers helping tech companies have clauses for non-reversed engineering and unintended uses clauses. I've put some technical spine problems here, which you can have a look at later. They're a little bit more detailed. And this really speaks to command and control issues, targeting issues, and really problems in the flaws of the technology. And I put these in a tech paper, which really speaks to how these interact with law and command and control, but really also how they interact with industry, with investment, with commercial problems that we already see in the business sector, in the finance sector, in banking, in policing, in the judiciary, and some of that, the violation tracker was really helpful in the research. Now, before I switch off in the last dying seconds of my talk, just to give you some divestment context, in the sector, Johan Andersen, who works for the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, was quoted to say, if you want to use this technology to cure cancer, that's fine. But if you want to look at autonomous weapons, we are going to have a look at you. Now, that was in 2016. In 2020, he was on the Government Ethics Committee for Norway, which I think Andrew Feinstein's organization actually advises. And they actually recommended that the government strike autonomous weapons and preclude them from their investment portfolio, and that this become law. In Germany, some of the largest banks have published in their sustainability reports that they're going to be looking at arms and controversial weapons. The Belgian banking sector is moving away from controversial and discriminate weapons. So this is already a trend. Now, to give you a context, because this is not law yet.
Tanya, forgive me, Tanya, just to chip in there. I'm not sure if you're aware, but that your slides aren't moving on as yet. So.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
That's.
It's not a problem in the sense that we know that everybody's going to be receiving a copy of the slides anyway when we set up.
I'm so sorry. Just bear with me. I've been changing them the entire time. Okay.
There we are.
Are you seeing anything now?
Yeah, so you've now moved on to the current law slide, that's right.
Okay, I think it's because I had it on an automatic. So there's there are the laws that I was going through, and legal precedent, and the technology. Here's the tech paper, which I will send you the link to. And this was the divestment context that I was just speaking about. And of course, I will share this with you. Sorry, Andy, I'm glad you told me. I had it on an automatic slide. It must not have linked to the screen share. So I was just telling you, I just switched to, I just mentioned the banks that were switching, and a quote from Johan Andersen, who I'm sure many of you will be familiar with because it's very much many of your sector, and a case study with nuclear weapons, that shortly after the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, which has been ratified by many states, which is why it's come into force. But within months of its adoption, Nordbank divested from all nuclear weapons related material, but Deutsche Bank, not known for its sort of ethical leading decision-making, divested from all fissionable material. Now in 2021 alone, the nuclear weapons industry lost $63 billion of investments from 127 institutions, many of whom touted that it was the TPNW being its reasoning. Now, as many of you know, asset managers look to investment trends. So where does that leave us? Some of the issues that we have facing us are who's sponsoring what happens in Parliament. And I know that there are others on this call who will speak to that with a lot more experience and interest than me. But we have a mixture of conflict of interests in sponsorship, and it's not necessarily a malevolent thing, but sometimes it's a buried or an opaque conflict of interest. We have board positions where there are conflicts of interest, and sometimes it's the very industries who have an interest in either burying regulation or leading the government's position. But we also have opaque investment portfolios due to the fact that this is dual use technology. So as to the fact that I've alluded, some of these technologies can do wonderful things, but they can also do something quite harmful. And if you don't have international domestic law protecting and providing safeguards on the pure science, you can sell something transboundaried to another country, and within that state, they can then use it for something that it was not intended for. So we really need law to protect, but also you can actually have protections as asset managers and say, well, we want controls over what this investment is going for. And lastly, and I think most importantly, rating agencies can very much tick the boxes around, well, we have ESGs and CSR, but if you don't have people with expertise around what to look for, then the lack of standardization around ESGs will mean that you can just make it a tick box exercise, and you can still very much be investing in maladaptive practices and maluse and funding. And lastly, in terms of what you can do, you can sign the Future of Life Pledge along with Google's DeepMind, UCL, Stephen Hawking, Stuart Russell. I mentioned Elon Musk. You can join the UK coalition and create a finance group with us, and join the campaign with us and Transparency Task Force, and create change around transparency in investments and ethical investments across the board, so that it really is transparent and democratic. Because as you know, money talks, and often it's really when money walks that you really have a democratic control over what's happening both in policy and with your assets. And I think I've already spoken for far too long, so I'm going to sign off, and I'll make sure that you get these slides. And thank you all for joining, and I'll sign off now. Thank you.
Tanielle, thank you very much indeed. I think before we do anything else, let's please show our appreciation to Tanielle for putting her slides and presentation together. Thank you very, very much indeed, Tanielle. Does anybody have any questions that are itching to ask Tanielle before we go to our next speaker? And by the way, our next speaker will either be Baroness Bennett if she's here. If not, we'll go straight to Lord Clement Jones. But does anybody have anything they'd like to put to Tanielle before we move on? Just wave a hand at me if you do. Otherwise, we'll move swiftly on. Is Baronet Bennett with us yet? If not, we'll have to slightly adjust the programme to suit. Looks like we need to do that. That's fine. So can we please invite Lord Clement Jones to pick up from here? Please just introduce yourself and explain why these topics we're covering today are of such interest to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Andy, thanks very much indeed. And in 5 minutes, well, thank you first of all to UNA UK for inviting me to just briefly talk about parliamentary activity really on lethal autonomous weapons. And in 5 minutes is quite difficult to summarize everything that's been going on, in particular in this year, and what many of us are trying to do with UK government policy. But it all began because a few years ago, I chaired the House of Lords Select Committee on AI, which considered the economic, ethical, and societal implications of advances in AI. And we reported in 2018. The report was called AI in the UK, Ready, Willing and Able, ? And we addressed in that report, amongst other things, the issue of military use of AI. And we said that this was perhaps the most emotive and high stakes area of AI of all. And we recommended that there actually be a full inquiry on its own into AI and lethal autonomous weapons. And we raised the issue again in our follow-up report, No Room for Complacency in 2020. Regressively, the government didn't do very much to follow up. And looking back to our report, one of the things that really concerned us more than anything else was the grey area surrounding the definition of lethal autonomous weapons themselves. And at the time, in the inquiry, we discovered that there was no definition in use by NATO or the UK of autonomous or automated. Now that's changed, and we've seen the sort of gradual progression of MOD and NATO thinking, but now it's claimed that despite the NATO definition of automated system and autonomous system, the UK has no operative definition of lethal autonomous weapon systems or laws. And given that that is the most problematic aspect, autonomy, the most problematic aspect, autonomy, has been defined, I find that an extraordinary state of affairs, and it seemed more like an excuse than anything else. At the time when our report came out in 2018, I was quite amused by the Express headline, "Rise of Killer Robots, Machines Could Turn on Humans as AI Set to Become Lawless." Now, and we thought, well, that's a classic tabloid headline. Now I'm not so sure. Maybe the Express was not being overly dramatic, given the lack of action that we've seen over the last few years. Last year, there have been considerable activity in Parliament. Gradually, I think there's been a greater understanding amongst parliamentarians of the issues involved. In November, I asked an oral question in the Lords asking the government what assessment they'd made of the calls at the August meeting of the GGE at the Convention on Conventional Weapons for a legally binding instrument, and what they were going to do at the meeting on the 2nd of December, and whether they were going to give a mandate to the negotiators to agree that there should be a legally binding instrument as called by the UN Secretary General. But I'm afraid to say that, as you all know, the government, despite fine words in the integrated review, that the UK remains at the forefront of the rapidly evolving debate on responsible development and use of AI and autonomy, etc., etc., and support across the political spectrum, and then internationally, nearly 70 states and thousands of scientists supporting the move, they refused to rule out the development of lethal autonomous weapons. And of course, we saw the eventual outcome at the CCW itself. Now, we know how important AI is to our military. You know, they've really given the game away. General Sir Mark Carleton-Smith, the Chief of the General Staff, said that he foresees the army of the future as the integration of boots and bots. But quite frankly, in the view of many parliamentarians, only lip service is currently being paid to the NATO principles of responsible use for AI. And of course, we still await the defense AI strategy coming down the track. And we've raised these questions on several other occasions. In March, during the passage of the Overseas Operations Bill, Lord Brown of Ladyton, who himself is a former Secretary of State for Defence, and Lord Houghton, the former Chief of Defence Staff, and you know, defence ministers continuously deny, in response to this being raised, deny they use systems that, quote, employ lethal force without context appropriate human involvement. But, you know, in itself, this is a step further than the original position which they took, was that the UK doesn't possess fully autonomous weapon systems. So there's a gradual movement by the UK in the wrong direction, quite frankly, in all of this. You know, so it's a question of the actual capability versus their unwillingness to actually do anything about it at the ECCW. And in fact, you know, they've actually set their face against doing anything at the CCW. In reply to my question, Baroness Goldie, who's the MOD minister in the Lords, said the UK and our partners are unconvinced by the calls for a further binding instrument. And she said, international humanitarian law provides a robust principle-based framework for the regulation of weapon deployment and use, which I think, you know, most of us would entirely disagree with. But, you know, we know that laws are already there. Autonomous drone warfare is already a fact of life. Turkish drones in Libya, etc., etc. And of course, the UN Secretary General has taken a pretty firm line on this, saying autonomous machines with the power and discretion to select targets and take lives without human involvement are politically unacceptable, morally repugnant, and should be prohibited by international law. But in the face of that, we still have no international agreement. Now, obviously, I am delighted to be working closely both with the Campaign Against Killer Robots and the UNA in the UK, and I put down some written questions. We'll keep up the pressure. But, you know, we really need to step up if we can, and the more parliamentarians that understand the issues, the better. So when the delayed defense AI policy comes out, I hope that we will pick up the cudgels again, let alone the AI governance white paper, which is due extremely shortly. Whether that will actually cover laws is another matter, but it jolly well should. And that's really where we've got to in Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Clement Jones, for such a speedy and comprehensive summary of where we are at with these issues from your point of view. Thank you very much indeed. Does anybody have any questions or comments that they would like to put to Lord Clement Jones? And if not, we'll ask Danielle just about possibly pick up on one or two of the themes that Lord Clement Jones spoke about. Wave a hand at me if you would like to speak or ask a question. Otherwise, Danielle, if I can just jump back to you, is there anything in particular that you'd like to pick up on from what we've just heard?
The major thing that strikes is the very important point that the government comments have thus far, the responses have been repetitively evasive and truncated, and the reports that have been promised have been delayed. So the parliamentarians who have been asking questions, like Lord Clement Jones, are invaluable, really. And I think it's going to be a case of further collaboration with us, which we're indebted to their work. It's been incredibly brave to hear them speak. There are other parliamentarians on the call who've spoken, and there have been fairly few calls for a ban, for progress, asking provocative questions, and the responses have been lackluster and really display either a lack of the real understanding or an unwillingness to answer the kinds of questions that really need answering by parliamentarians and by the public. So there's work to be done, and we're grateful as a campaign, as civil society experts, that there are the kinds of parliamentarians who have the gumption, the courage and the expertise to ask those questions, really. So it's really now is the time to be more forceful and provocative. And as was mentioned, there are reports that have been, we ask those questions every time we have meetings with the MOD and the FCDO, and we get a lot of, oh, it's coming, it's really coming. And then we'll have to ask, well, what sort of work is being done with civil society? And they say, oh, well, we do talk to them, and it will be sort of one colleague of ours who's the one sort of token civil society expert who they kind of wheel out for the odd meeting. So it's just not good enough. It's really not good enough. But we're grateful to work with the people on this call and a couple of others.
Tanya, thank you very much indeed. Folks, let's please show our appreciation to the input we've had today from Lord Clement Jones. Thank you very much indeed, Tim. Thank you. Very, very good indeed. And we'll go swiftly.
Andy.
You're most welcome. You're most welcome. We'll go swiftly on to Kevin Hollinrake, who I'm sure is going to want to talk about a number of things, perhaps including the idea of an economic crime bill. Kevin, please bring us right up to date. And I would like to just emphasize my support for Kevin and his work in relation to what he does on the APPG for Fair Business Banking, and also now the Treasury Select Committee, and also for taking time to speak at Transparency Task Force events time after time after time. Thank you, Kevin. Over to you. Thank you.
Hi, Andy, and thanks for inviting me. I'll try and keep the time. So I'll put me at the time. I've got to go at 1 o'clock, so I know you're on to 1:30, but yeah, my take is actually slightly different. Fantastic presentations I've just listened to, which is very, very shocking. Of course, as anybody who's watched a good James Bond movie knows, the villains in those plots are always fabulously wealthy. And so my focus is in, and there's obviously they're the ones that are likely to really use this stuff for nefarious purposes, more likely than anybody else. There's some of these are the despots and the terrorists that Danielle talked about. But so it's the murky money element of this that really is my area of expertise within Parliament. And this stuff, finances every major crime, and indeed small crimes as well, you can think of, whether it's people trafficking, drugs, extortion, terrorism, corruption, fraud on a huge scale. 100 billion a year it costs the UK in fraud. You may have seen yesterday when Lord Agnew stepped down, he said it's costing the public sector, the taxpayer, effectively 30 billion a year through fraud of the government, effectively. Impoverishes nations. And it's good to hear that certain banks are divesting themselves of their involvement in certain areas. But the worry is, of course, there are back doors to all that. I mean, if you look, the major banks, only recently NatWest was fined £260 million for effectively facilitating money laundering, which is the most gratuitous money laundering you can ever think of, which is people walking into banks with black bin bags full of cash. The HSBC were fined, I think, £1.2 billion in the USA for effectively letting Mexican drug cartel money flow through their banks. And Standard Chartered about 1.1 billion for similar offences to do with nations, including Iran. So we might think we're divesting ourselves from areas that could cause huge problems for us in the future for our nation, but actually the criminals will find a way, the terrorists will find a way, the despots will find a way, and we're allowing this to happen. These are the world's worst evils that effectively the UK is facilitating. Not just the UK, I want to add, but nevertheless, some of our rules make it particularly easy for the UK, for people to channel their money, to funnel their money through the UK. Good example of this is a great book by Oliver Bullough called Moneyland, really worth a read. If you doubt the fact that this stuff is facilitated effectively through UK entities, and I'll describe which they are in a minute. These are shell companies, these are UK property, lots of different ways people can channel the money through the UK. But he sets out a story of a guy called Viktor Yanukovych, who is a poorly paid public servant in the Ukraine, obviously topical at the moment. He was earning less than £2,000 a month, public servant, yet him and I think 45 cronies of his accumulated assets equivalent to 50% of the Ukraine economy, size of the Ukraine economy. A huge, huge amount of wealth through kleptocracy. And that money is channeled through companies that are established in the UK. Phenomenal wealth. And so some of the devices that these people use to do that, I say, are facilitated in the UK. It costs 12 quid to register a company in the UK. It's one of the cheapest and easiest ways to set up a company in the UK. But of course, in terms of establishing new companies in a dynamic business environment, you think that's a good idea. But what it lets happen, of course, is these companies are established with discrete ownership, money from all over the world, derived from all kinds of nefarious activities, are channeled through those companies into other parts of the world. There's pointless nicking money, there's pointless extorting money, it's pointless making money out of drug deals and the rest of it if you can't do anything with the money. And it's very difficult to do stuff with cash. You've got to be able to launder it. So companies, UK companies, very easy to do that. UK trusts, shell companies. We have company formation agents in the UK that will set you up a company and a bank account so easily with very few checks and balances, hardly regulated at all. Similarly with London property. So you can buy a property, or anywhere in the UK, buy a property and conceal the beneficial owner of that property. So if you've got a load of cash you've stolen from your nation, and let's remember there was a fantastic report back in, I think, 2000 from Oxfam, and not particularly fantastic if you think about it, but it said that the amount of wealth that is stolen by corrupt officials and politicians around the world at that point was 50 billion pounds a year. This is 21 years ago. And funnily enough, the actual international, the size of the international aid budget for every nation combined was 50 billion pounds. So the countries that we're helping in terms of funding, trying to get them back on their feet and helping them to develop, the same amount of money is going through the back door into kleptocrat pockets. So, and lots of this goes into things like London property. So, as Andy says, what we want to see is an economic crime bill. Really worryingly, Lord Agnew said today in the Financial Times, this has been scrapped with the Queen's speech this year. Real concerns about that. Treasury Select Committee's got a report coming out next week, which I think is a very good report, published on Wednesday. There's a launch session on that report on Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock. It's done in conjunction with Which. So please register for that. If you Google the Treasury Select Committee and Which, it should come up. But effectively, you'll guess what's in that report. Reforms of Companies House, to move it from being a register to a regulator, just checks and balance on who actually owns things. A register of overseas entities, which means we can find out who owns properties in the UK. So this money can't simply be hidden in UK properties. A failure to prevent offence. So large corporations like the banks I mentioned would have to put the checks and balances in place. So this money laundering stuff cannot happen. Otherwise, they would be criminally liable for the first time ever, including individually. We need whistleblower legislation. Most economic crime is identified by whistleblowers, about 40% of it. We need to beef up our whistleblower legislation. And finally, and probably as important as anything else, we need the proper resources in our crime fighting agencies to be able to track down these illegal activities and make sure those people are held to account, both in the UK and further afield. Thanks, Andy.
Kevin, thank you very, very much indeed. And it really is, it is shocking that there seems to be pushback on something as right-minded as an economic crime bill. Obviously, I'm inevitably going to ask you to speculate as to what the pushback is and what the basis of that pushback is. Any thoughts on that, Kevin? Why is it not happening?
I don't know. I mean, I'm really shocked actually, because I know the Treasury's in favour of it. I think Bay is in favour of it. I think, so this, I mean, clearly there's a great temptation in government to do nothing, because every time you move one dial, of course, lots of other dials move. So you've got to be careful on legislation. But this stuff we've been promising to do for years. And if one thing you'll read the Treasury Select Committee report, it just sets out such a number of areas where sensible measures have been put in place that have been delayed and delayed and delayed. And the only probably answer I can give you, Andy, of course, there are vested interests in all this stuff. So you've got a very powerful financial services sector in the UK, a sector we should be very proud of, but nevertheless, its reputation in part isn't that good, which is what you said in your original slide. But I'm not sure they would want to have their collars felt, to be honest with you. And it means if you let this money laundering happen in the future, that's the potential could happen. So I'm not saying that that's where the pushback's coming from, but there certainly will be some pushback from that direction.
So thank you very much indeed, Kevin. I'm going to share my screen just to talk a little bit about Violation Tracker before we briefly go to Pauline Creasy for her thought. And the reason I'm going to share my screen is because I want you all to understand that we have this free to use utility available for all of us called Violation Tracker UK. It's only been made possible because of the support received by a number of organisations to make it happen. And the people in Washington, DC have been doing an amazing job in getting it over here. But let me just show you this. If you go to the home page, and I'll provide a link to this in a moment, if you go to advanced search, and if you scroll down and go to the section called offence type, you can search in many, many different ways. So, for example, the sort of searches that might be relevant to today's meeting could be accounting fraud or deficiencies, anti-money laundering deficiencies, which I'll come back to, banking violations, bribery, so on, so forth. Let me just show you what happens when you click on anti-money laundering deficiencies. And remember, money laundering checks is essentially the first line of defense against the kind of things that Kevin's just been speaking about. So any breach of anti-money laundering rules is really quite a serious concern. And then what we see here is the top 10 parent companies. So Deutsche Bank, the worst offender in terms of fines against it for anti-money laundering breaches, then Standard Chartered, then Barclays, etc. And you then see a very, 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 very long list of infringements by these banks. And if the purpose of the economic crime bill is to tighten up on these sorts of things, then you really do have to wonder why it's not being enthusiastically supported by every single stakeholder out there. And by the way, what you can do with this database, if you click on, for example, the bottom one here, National Westminster Bank PLC, it'll take you to some detail about the case. And you can click through all the way to the source of the data, as I'm doing now, just to show you how this works. And in this particular instance, it's quite revealing because no individuals are being charged as part of these proceedings. I'm going to repeat that. No individuals are being charged as part of these proceedings. And the reason I'm emphasizing that, folks, is because surely, if we really want things to change, there has to be a regulatory regime that is built in some way on personal accountability and personal jeopardy for doing things wrong. Unless individuals are at risk of consequences of malpractice, surely we're just inviting all this dirty money just to continue to be perpetuated ad infinitum. Pauline, if I can invite you to very briefly make your point, and then we'll go straight to Ben at Transparency International. Pauline, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I just have a quick comment, and then I have a question for Kevin Hollenrake, if I may. I'm very, very pleased, Kevin, and everybody listening, to hear that the Companies House reform is going through, pushed by the Treasury Committee, and I really hope it is implemented and there is some sort of assessment of how well it's going to work. I cannot express to you the shock and frustration of myself and my group, you know, the Premier FX fraud, when we were investigating the fraud, and we discovered that at Companies House you could actually allow a firm to register false accounts for many years without any checks or validation that anything that was being put up there was correct. This went on for more than 12 years, and we just could not believe it, and had some terrible conversations with the guy that ran Companies House at the time, who was extremely defensive about their role. He also said it would be extremely difficult and would require rather a large amount of resources to actually do a proper validation. So I don't know whether that's being taken on board, Kevin. I'm sure it is, but he was rather, without mentioning his name, he was rather skeptical about how it could be done. And I'll give you an example. You know, Premier FX were posting accounts of under 2.7 million to avoid independent audit. And in fact, they were moving 1.6 billion and clearly involved in money laundering as well as scamming their customers. And then, so that's kind of like a mini question. And then I had my other question was, Kevin, do you have, or does the Treasury Committee have any idea about the scale of the power of the shadow market or the murky money in the United Kingdom? What percentage do you think it might be in terms of moving money around in the UK?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Just touching on Andy's point about individual sanctions, which I think is key to this. You know, I always use the analogy in the world of health and safety in the construction industry. Deaths on building sites and construction sites didn't start to fall dramatically, deaths and serious injury, until they made directors personally liable for flaws in their health and safety procedure. Not for the accident itself necessarily, but making sure there are checks and balances in place. That's what failure to prevent does. In the NatWest case, today, the FCA, when they found them 260 million quid, they could have taken out individual sanctions against individuals under the senior manager regime, but they said most of the stuff happened pre-2016 when that was introduced. To be honest, they haven't used it once yet. So we've got to not just have regulations, we've got a regulation. And that's back to your point in terms of Companies House. You know, you've got to have the resources. As I said before, what we've been proposing, and I won't tell you what the Treasury Select Committee report says, but won't be too far away from this, is a fee, a levy of a certain amount, so tens of pounds, that would add to the cost of the formation itself, which would then go into a pot for regulation. So there is sufficient monies to be able to do the checks and balances, on the company establishment, which is the key really, and things like cross-referencing of directors into previous things they have done wrong, previous breaches or criminal offences. Really interesting when we talk about autonomous weapons, because clearly one weapon you can bring to bear in the search for this kind of stuff to improve our intelligence in this area is artificial intelligence. That's exactly what it's there for. It should be able to put together not just the database in Companies House, but cross-reference that with so many other databases in the world of open banking and lots of other open databases to be able to give some tools to help regulators identify wrongdoing. So a big piece of work was really got to start with some money, which should be derived from a levy.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. Thank you. Interesting stuff and very, very important stuff. We're going to be moving on. Baroness Bennett, I'm very pleased to say, has just arrived, but we'll go to Ben from Transparency International first, and then we'll jump back to Baroness Bennett after Ben has spoken. But can we please show our appreciation to Kevin, not just for being here today and being part of this event, but all the, frankly, all the amazing work he's doing on lots of different fronts to try to clean up the UK's financial services sector. You really do amazing work, Kevin, and it's great that you're championing at the bit to drive this stuff forward, because we need people like you in Parliament to do what you do. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you very, very much. Ben at Transparency International, let's hear from you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Andy, for organising today. My name is Ben Cowdock. I'm Investigations Lead for Transparency International UK. My main role is looking at the role of the UK in the global dirty money system. So it's very much follows on from what Kevin was saying. And he gave a very good introduction of what we call Moneyland, where kleptocrats are able to use London property, UK companies, and UK financial services firms to move their money around the world without any reprisals. So I want to talk today about Transparency International's new work, research released last year on electronic money institutions. So these firms offer a difference to sort of general high street banks. They're not as well known, but it's still a £500 billion a year industry. And we've identified a number of concerning money laundering risks throughout the sector, which show it could be a new frontier for money launderers looking to move dirty money around the world. So a bit of context on this sector first and why we decided to look at it. A couple of years ago, we identified along with many others, that the UK shell company industry was in line with Baltic banking industry, which was a sort of a main use for these industrial money laundering schemes, which have seen hundreds of billions of pounds moved around the world. But as regulators and police have got more wise to these, the money launderers have had to sort of move to different sectors. And we identified that the UK's electronic money institution sector is one of these sectors. So we carried out some research on the UK's 261 electronic money institutions. We looked at who owned them, what their business associations were, and how they marketed their services on the internet to prospective users. So we broke down the money laundering risk in this sector into sort of three key areas. The first of these is the owners of these institutions. So these should be the first line of defense against money laundering. They should be checking their clients' money. They should be looking at exactly who they're doing business with and having a greater understanding of the money laundering risks that their clients pose. But the first major issue we found is that the owners of these are often accused themselves of money laundering, or they have associations with individuals accused of money laundering, which is extremely worrying because they themselves might be complicit in moving this money around the world. We found red flags against 1 in 3 of these institutions, which gives you a scale of how much risk there is here. So the fact that you have a person at the top of a company that may be complicit, responsible for carrying out money laundering checks, shows you how ludicrous this system is. And whilst the FCA have these fit and proper tests for directors and owners of these firms, we don't think these are being stringently enough applied. So the FCA really does need to look again at this sector at a very basic level, carrying out the due diligence that they'd expect banks to carry out on clients, on the people that they're authorising to operate. The second worrying concern that we found is the associations these electronic money institutions have with other firms around the world. So to be able to move money around internationally, they need access to correspondent banking, which means they need to partner with major international banks, both here and around the world, in places like the EU, US, Southeast Asia as well. And we found that correspondent banks that many of these institutions had relationships with had previously been fined for major money laundering breaches. One of the key ones here is Ria Tumu, which is based in Latvia. It's been fined by the French authorities and the Latvian authorities for major money laundering deficiencies. So you've got firms in the UK with red flags over them partnering with these industrial banks overseas with money laundering deficiencies, which is sort of multiplying the risk here. Another concerning association we found between these electronic money institutions was their relationships with these trust and company service providers. So the people that Kevin mentioned earlier that set up shell companies here in the UK and abroad. So you find on the websites of some of these institutions the ability to get essentially a bank account for your shell company to move money around the world, which again increases the risk that these firms are going to be associated with money laundering because the way that they're advertising their services. So you have, again, a number of these that are sort of partnering with trust and company information agents who have formed shell companies used in money laundering schemes in the past. So again, we're looking at the multiplication of the money laundering risk here in this sector. And to make matters worse is the final area of risk that we looked at, which is the markets these firms operate in. So whilst they're operating services in the UK, they're also presenting themselves on Russian and Ukrainian language websites to people with potentially higher risk backgrounds and higher risk funds to move, alongside shell companies to be able to move their money around the world with essentially the stamp of approval of a UK financial institution. So if a bank in the US, for example, sees money moving to it from a UK electronic money institution, they might expect that checks have been carried out on that money and the owner of that money, when in fact what we're finding is that that couldn't be further from the truth. We're seeing major deficiencies throughout the sector. And a final major risk that we're seeing is that you yourself can buy an electronic money institution on channels like LinkedIn for as little as £600,000. So you could essentially own what is very much similar to a bank. These can hold money and they can move money around the world. And the people selling these electronic money institutions are not going to be carrying out any checks on you. And it's unlikely that the FCA will be carrying out checks on you as well. So what this all pulls together is what we see as a really concerning emerging area of risk in the UK, alongside what we already knew about in the sort of fintech e-payment industry. So this all together, along with the issues around property and money laundering through UK shell companies, is extremely concerning. And we're also concerned to see the UK government apparently dropping this economic crime bill that's supposed to be going into the next legislative session. It's important to note that that is in May, and the government still has time to do a U-turn on this. So we would definitely encourage them to do that, because without this new Companies House reform and without the UK's property register to unveil owners of overseas companies owning UK property, we're faced with fighting financial crime with one hand tied behind our back. So this is a really critical point for the UK's fight against this, and it's heading in the wrong direction at the moment. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
And thank you very much indeed. We're good for time at the moment. Does anybody have anything they would love to say at this point before we go to our next speaker, who will be Baroness Bennett? I see Pauline Crease has put her hand up again. Pauline, let's go to you briefly. Keep it as concise as you possibly can, please. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks very much, Kevin and Ben. Of course, the electronic money institution is looked at by the FCA as the same as the payment service firms. And the fraud that I mentioned earlier, Premier FX, was one of those payment service firms. And as you probably know as well as I do, and the Treasury Committee will do, is that they fall into the small and medium firms category, which are not looked at very much by the FCA. They have admitted that on record with myself and my committee, which was an amazing admission of a failure of regulation, and it has not been improved. Our fraud took place 3.5 years ago, and there have been several other frauds, as you know, in the payment services industry, and you've spoken very well about what's going on in the electronic money institution area. Both of them, the payment service firms and the EMIs, are very easy vehicles for fraud. And I'm just horrified that you're saying that the UK is thinking of not pushing through the legislation. And I'm just wondering what the Treasury Committee can do about that. And maybe Kevin or Ben could perhaps reply on that, if not now, but maybe later. Because certainly I'm very concerned. We've been pushing the Treasury Committee, given what's happened to us. It was a 12.3 million fraud, for 194 consumers, which I know in the scale of city stuff is not a big deal, but it was a big deal to the individuals who, you know, had their money stolen so easily. And, you know, tracing it back, it was clear that they were operating under the radar in plain sight. And it was not being checked by anybody, by the bankers, nor by the FCA, unfortunately.
Thank you.
So I'll leave that with you. Yeah, hopefully somebody can answer that later.
I think Kevin may want to come in at that point. Kevin, any further thoughts on this?
Yeah, as you know, sincere sympathy for this, and we corresponded lots of times, and with the fraud investigation agencies, SFO, National Crime Agency, and the FCA on this, and you know, their position is it's identifying a culprit, and the culprit is long gone, of course, and there's no easy answers, I'm afraid, and lots of this stuff, there are no easy answers when things have gone wrong. I know that's no consolation to you and many people invested in that same enterprise, but yeah, the regulatory environment needs to be sharper, it needs to be tighter, it needs to be more fleet of foot, and it needs to have more resources. I think it is very fair to say.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin and Pauline. And talking about resources, I put a note in the chat. According to Anthony Stansfeld, the former police crime commissioner and one of the UK leads on fraud, I believe I'm right in saying that over a third of crime in the UK is now related to fraud. You're more likely to become a victim of fraud than any other crime, but only 1% of police resources is allocated to that. So it seems to me that there needs to be a bit of a better connection between the problems we've got in society and the amount of resources being allocated to them. Kevin, thank you again very much indeed. Let's now go to Baroness Bennett. It's quite a busy day in Parliament today for all sorts of reasons. As a consequence, we're having to jiggle the programme around a little bit. Alan is not going to be able to be with us later on today, but we are good for time. So Natalie Bennett, over to you. Thank you very much, Baroness Bennett, for being with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, and please everyone make it Natalie. But your introduction, your comment about fraud, make a perfect introduction for what I wanted to start with, because I thought I'd start with not my own words, but start with the words of Lord Agnew of Alton, which some people will probably know why he's in the news. And this is his words from Hansard yesterday. I'm reading them out. Total fraud loss across government is estimated at £29 billion a year. Of course, not all can be stopped, but a combination of arrogance, indolence, and ignorance freezes the government machine. And also in Lord Agnew's speech yesterday, I think there's a very interesting note where he actually says that he'd written to the British Business Bank specifically about fraud around the COVID grants. He was placing in Hansard a copy of that. This is the minister who's in charge of controlling fraud in the government, who says he sent a letter to the British Business Bank on the 16th of December. I have still not received an answer. So I think one of the questions we really have to ask ourselves is the British state being run for the people, or is it being run for profits for a small number of people? And it increasingly is clear which direction we're heading in. For anyone who didn't see this, I kind of suspect most people on this call probably did, but Baroness Smith of Basildon, who's one of the very experienced peers, said it was one of the most dramatic moments in the House. The minister in charge of fraud resigned, handed his resignation letter to the whip standing beside him, and walked out yesterday. And that really, for a measure of the state of the British state, I think that was a very telling moment. And I think I'm sure very few people were paying attention, but we were also yesterday after that in the health and care bill. And there's a clause in that which actually had all sides of the House utterly up in arms, including Tories, and basically says that all NHS procurement, the government will produce regulations in future to decide how that might be controlled. These are regulations that will go through unless we change the law under a negative procedure, effectively have no scrutiny at all, and that will determine how NHS spending fund in total, I mean, lots of it's salaries for doctors and nurses and things, but the total, 100 billion, well over 100 billion pounds a year. So I think we've got to really look at the situation we have now, where we have a state that really is, we talk about corporate capture a lot in the Lords, a state that really is in control of the financial sector, that really is not operating according to the will of the people or for the best well-being of the people. But we have a huge problem here. And there's just, you know, everywhere you look, there's so many issues. I will, in the health bill tomorrow, be talking about the care homes. And this is an area where care homes very often are owned by hedge funds that are taking usually 12 to 16% returns, which I'm sure I don't need to show anyone on this call, in the current circumstances, that's a massive rate of return, out of profits from caring for the most vulnerable people in our society. And now they're saying, oh, well, we can't afford to pay our staff anymore, and we can't get any staff, and we can't afford to pay for the rise in the minimum wage. So that's, again, what that's being run for. Again, what I'll be doing is putting into amendments saying that no money should go in profits until absolutely every need is met, and no money should go off into tax havens. And I was actually on Yorkshire Politics North talking about the water system and Yorkshire Water. And I didn't know this, but it's defined, until I was looking around this, it's defined as water poverty if you pay more than 5% of your take-home income in water bills. Now, nearly 8% of people in Yorkshire are in water poverty, paying more than 8%, paying more than 5% of their income in bills. And the boss is paid well over £100 million a year, and they're taking out, more than £1 million a year, and they're taking out, well over £100 million in dividends, going to a whole series of ownership, the usual story, eventually going to a company based in Jersey. So it really is worth saying that, if you look from care homes, if you look from water, you look at the absolute basics in our society, look at the fraud that's around the whole COVID situation, we have a huge problem. And it just strikes me again and again that I listen to people from the other side of the house, people who might be regarded as representatives of the financial sector, get up and say, oh, we're terribly clean, we have great rules. And that really is clearly more and more becoming a simply unsayable statement. And that's where we are now. And what I think is really changing is we are starting to see where there's some real chances of progress. And I was actually at a meeting that was primarily about the situation in Hong Kong and the Chinese government's treatment of Hong Kong. But there was also a lot of concern about how certain large financial institutions are lining up on the side of the Chinese government. And of course, we have, and with the very, very disturbing situation in Ukraine and with regard to Russia, and institutions that are lined up, financial institutions that are very much lined up with the Russian government, with the Putin regime. There are a lot of people who were not perhaps traditionally from my side of politics, who were starting to say, this is all a bit of a worry, and perhaps we really do have to look at the regulation. So what I would say is, politically, there's a real space at the moment to really start to fight the battles. And people who would previously have gone, oh yes, we're fine, it's clean, it's, look at the rankings, London is clean, are really saying, well, we just can't say that anymore, it's just unsayable. And I think, to finish off my initial remarks, I always think dialogue's better than monologue. When we come back to Lord Agnew yesterday, that really can be a telling moment. We need to keep pointing to that, to keep pointing to his words, and point out this was a person who was on the inside with clearly good intentions, and found that he simply couldn't deliver. He couldn't even get the boss of a bank to respond to his letter when he was the minister. So we can make new alliances, we can get together, we can really start to take this on. And it's absolutely crucial that we do, whether it's for those people living in poverty in Yorkshire, the poor, people in the care homes not getting the care they need. All of these are victims of the financial sector, and it's really important we make this. And don't let people say, oh, it's this esoteric, complex thing over there that, it's all really hard to understand. This is ultimately about people's lives, the resources they have available to them, about poverty and inequality, and we need to frame it in those terms. Thanks very much.
Natalie, thank you very much indeed. It's always great to hear you speak at our events. It really, really is. Natalie, the economic crime bill, it looks like for some reasons we don't yet understand, it looks like there's a lack of appetite in government for it. Kevin explained earlier that it looks like it may not happen, which to me and many others I'm sure will look pretty disastrous. The Transparency Task Force is essentially a campaign organisation, and I'm wondering if we should try to do something about that. I'm wondering, for example, if we should reach out to all of our members. We've got about 5,000 of them, roughly 3,000 in the UK, and very simply perhaps provide them with just the basis of a standard letter that they could send to their MPE, setting out the reasons why it's absolutely vital that there's an economic crime bill in this Parliament. Do you think that kind of grassroots effort could actually make a difference? Is it worth trying something like that, do you think?
I think it's definitely worth trying that. I mean, it's all of these things. It's a pincer movement coming from lots of different directions. I mean, I think one of the things that perhaps we could do this, and I'm perhaps not the logical person to lead this. I don't know if it's something Kevin might be up for, but you know, we could have a cross-party letter, also separately a letter from people from both houses of Parliament to the government. So you know, we have a grassroots effort, and we also have a parliamentary effort. You know, again, you know, the point I keep coming back to is what I find again and again. You know, both people in Parliament, people outside Parliament. It's like, oh, you know, economic regulation. It's all terribly difficult and complicated, and there's fancy terms, and there's all these organisations. It's too hard. Is really making it clear that we have a crime problem, and you know, you can quote Lord Agnew, and there needs, you know, it's not under control, it's wildly out of control, and we need this regulation. So I think what the key thing is to make these things not as non-technical as possible, so that we really explain to people that, you know, you can get involved in this. You don't have to feel like this is something we have to leave to the experts.
Thank you. That's a really positive response. Perhaps we'll try to get some kind of a working party involved to sort of think about these ideas and drive them forward. And maybe, you never know, we can reach out to Lord Agnew himself and see if he'd be happy to perhaps give some advice and guidance on it. You never know. He might be quite minded to do that at this point in time. Excellent, Natalie. Thank you very much. Any comments or questions for Natalie, or indeed regarding anything else we've been discussing so far? Please just wave your hand at me if you'd like to come in there. Ben from United Nations Association, I can see you waving away. Please fire away with your thought. Thank you.
Hello. And thanks so much, Natalie, for that really actually worrying picture that you painted about, you know, the lack of accountability in this whole sector. I'm just wondering what you think about the collision between the whole situation that you've just discussed and this permissive environment that is just not working, and the issue of emerging technology and the huge boom that we're seeing in spending on things like autonomous weapons. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Ben. And I think this is where kind of, I mean, I could have brought that in too, sort of the whole point of none of this is actually for people's well-being. None of this is, you know, it's actively dangerous, and lethal autonomous weapons, as you know, is something that I'm actually very keen to do work on, and I'm the Opaque parliamentary group that's involved in that. I think that there is a real, underlying narrative, an Uber narrative here, which is the entire society, the entire planet is being run for the financial sector. And you know, another area I could very much bring in here is oil and gas. And it's something that Caroline Lucas, is really, I know, basically going to spend her year focusing on, looking at the intersection of the financial sector and oil and gas. And if you look at, you know, the intersection of the financial sector and the weapons trade, there's similar nexus, and indeed you find people on different boards crossing over those things. And I think we've really got to say, what is the financial sector for? The financial sector should be there to serve the real economy, the economy we need, the economy that feeds us, that provides our nurses and doctors, the economy that provides our houses. And you know, you can also go to the building sector, for example, and certainly immediately after the financial crash, there was an absolutely amazing graph that showed the big six builders, their profits were going up every year, and the number of houses they were building down was going down every year. Now, what is a building company for? You might think a building company would be to produce houses. that actually your building companies were being used to produce profits, and houses were an incidental byproduct of that. And we have this situation that it really is, and I may be about to get slightly too political for some people, but we're in the last zombie days of neoliberalism, whereby everything is being run for the financial sector to create profits. And the interesting thing is those profits have generally been pumped into tax havens, and they sit there in those tax havens. And we come to the sort of a fundamental question about money. Money sitting in the tax haven is not even very much use to the person who has control of that money. Money only really works and is productive when it goes round and round and is being spent in the economy. And so we're just, my good news story on many things, but particularly in this area, is things cannot continue as they are. Where we are now is profoundly unstable. Now, there's a huge challenge there, and you can tell, quite scary, or very scary story about lethal autonomous weapons, about weapons more generally, and about the conflicts that threaten us in the world today. But there's also a potential to say, well, this whole system, is falling apart. And if you do have people like Lord Agnew walking out of it, then there's a real chance to actually build a new coalition that says we need a financial sector that's a servant, not a master.
That's a great exchange of thoughts there. Thank you so much, Ben, for putting that question to Natalie. Wow, this is a very rich conversation we're having, and clearly there's a lot of concern about the way things are going. Natalie, part of our event today was about the idea that if all this carries on going the way it is, the very fabric of our democracy could be in some way undermined or diluted. Is that people like me just being unnecessarily worrisome, or are there, looking at it from your point of view as an experienced parliamentarian, are there signs that our democracy is in some way in jeopardy here?
Well, I would say, first of all, to be just a titsy bit provocative, I would say that the UK is not a democracy in terms of Boris Johnson got 44% of the votes in 2019 and 100% of the power. I'm speaking to you from the unelected House of Lords, which I came into with the aim of abolishing it as soon as possible and ending up with an elected House of Lords. But what freedoms and rights that we have, and what democratic control that we have, I think is very definitely under threat. And if you actually look at the long chain of this, of what we're saying, there's a risk we're not going to see an economic crime bill, but we've seen the police bill, which the House of Lords, one of the things that's really interesting is records are being broken all over the place. Yesterday, Lord Agnew was described as one of the most dramatic things that ever happened in the House. That's a week after the House of Lords defeated the government 14 times in one day on the police bill. Now, that was because of the extremely repressive nature of the police bill, but it's also partly because the government had brought in a whole slew of new repressive elements to that bill, which hadn't gone through the Commons, which is something which, by protocol is never done. And the government did it, and the Lords threw it out. And in this case, the government can't bring them back. But lots of the things we did throw out, the government can and may well try to bring back. But there's the police bill. I was just discussing this morning the judicial review bill, which threatens the judges' right to say when the law's been broken. There's the election bill, which both includes voter repression and sees the government taking control of the Electoral Commission. We just have this slew. If you look at all the legislation coming before us now is actually taking away rights, taking away democracy. That is what the government is focused on. And that is the practical reality of this. And I was actually a relatively small C Conservative veteran legal peer I was talking to the other day. I said to him something that S.A. Temel-Orkan, the Turkish activist and author of there's 5 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship, just focused on Turkey, but I did an event with her, and she said, you in the West, in the UK, in the US, in France, you think, collapse of governments, takeovers are something that happens in other places over there. It can happen to you. There's absolutely nothing that says that it can't happen. And if you absolutely look at what this government's agenda is, just write the list of all of the bills and what they're doing, you'd have to say, if the government manages to get all of these through and all of these in place, there's a lot of people saying that in the US, Trump may seize, Trump or a Trump type figure may seize the next election, and that might be the last election in the US. We're not very far from the same situation.
Wow, it really is very concerning indeed. Clearly, our message to everybody is we mustn't allow ourselves to be complacent, and as a consequence, stand by. We need to stand up here. We need to use what we have within our democracy to try to make the difference that we collectively can make, because I'm absolutely convinced, as many others are, that if we do find ways of working together, we can make a difference. We really can make a difference. In just a moment, we're going to hear from Andrew Feinstein. Before we go to Andrew, I just want to mention that one of the issues that we think is at the heart of all of this is the revolving door problem. And I won't spend time explaining it now, but we have an event on the 8th of February about that. We've got people from the European Parliament involved. We've got subject matter experts from the US involved as well. A lot's happening. I'll make sure we send you the notes out about that revolving door problem event, because we can't really have the democracy we want if we have a blurring of the lines between the City of London and our Parliament, for example. We're going to go to Andrew, then after that...
Andy, just briefly, because I know Andrew's about to speak, but there's a comment from Lord Brown,
okay,
Michaela and Shandila.
Yeah, what we'll do, if we can, we're going to get Andrew's session done, and we'll open it up to Q&A after that. We'll open it right up. I think there's a lot that people would like to say. Thank you, Tanya. I did notice. So let's go to Andrew. Andrew, please take a moment to introduce yourself. Just before we do that, how it would be remiss of me to not invite everybody to show our appreciation for Natalie's session. Natalie, thank you very, very much indeed. And we'll go straight now to Andrew. Please do introduce yourself, because not everybody will know about you or your background and the passion you have for the topic you're about to talk about. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Andy. And thanks so much for the invitation to all of the organizers and to putting this really great event together. And also just to thank the speakers for the amazing work that they are doing, some of which I was aware of, but some of which I wasn't. By way of background, I was an ANC member of parliament in South Africa under Nelson Mandela. I chaired the committee that drafted the country's financial management legislation after our first democratic election in 1994, and was then the ranking ANC member on the Public Accounts Committee, and resigned from Parliament in protest at my own party's refusal to allow an unfettered investigation into an arms deal in which a minimum of $350 million of bribes were paid to senior politicians, officials, executives of the state arms company, and various assorted intermediaries. Many people, even who know my work, don't know that I also spent 5.5 years working in the City of London, co-managing a small investment bank, part of the Investec group of companies, which gives me perhaps another angle on some of the topics we're discussing today. And since then, I've been a researcher and writer on the global arms trade and on what we describe as state capture, something that I'll talk a bit more about in a moment through my very small organization called Shadow World Investigations. And I've put links in the chat to the organization, to the Shadow World book that I wrote, The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade, and to another shorter book, Indefensible: 7 Myths That Sustain the Global Arms Trade, which you can read for free online at the link that I posted in the chat. What I want to do is actually pick up on quite a lot of what Natalie has said in terms of the intersections between underregulated financial flows and the underregulated trade in weaponry, of which, of course, autonomous weapons are an extremely important and ever-growing part. And while there are good reasons for us to reaffirm how underregulated financial flows are, and the financial sector is in general, it is worth recalling that perhaps the premier anti-corruption campaigner of probably the post-Second World War world, an extraordinary Norwegian French woman called Eva Joly, who some of you who are sort of my sort of age might remember as an investigating magistrate in France who blew open the Elf Aquitaine scandal in the 1980s and has had to be under secure protection ever since then. Eva Joly once in a speech in the parliamentary buildings in London described the city of London as the money laundering capital of the world. And while Dubai is pushing hard to compete, certainly our research indicates that the City of London still holds that extremely unfortunate title. But if you think the financial sector is underregulated, you ain't seen nothing yet. When it comes to the arms trade, as Amnesty International said quite a few years ago, the trade in weapons is regulated less than the trade in bananas. And unfortunately, that is very true. If we look just at the United Kingdom, where the government often claims to have amongst the best arms export controls in the world, a claim that, to put it politely, is at best mendacious. It's worth bearing in mind that even after the appeal court in this country had ruled that arms sales to Saudi Arabia as a consequence of the violations of international humanitarian law in the conflict in Yemen, that such arms sales are in fact unlawful in terms of British law, the government simply continued to export weapons to Saudi Arabia. And there is no standing committee in our parliamentary system that actually has meaningful power to oversee the export of arms from the United Kingdom, one of the 5 biggest producers of weapons in the world. We have something called the Committees on Arms Export Controls, that is an amalgam of various other committees and that has no longevity and has absolutely no power in terms of parliamentary rules. It's also worth bearing in mind that the situation is about to get worse. The government is about to further weaken arms export control rules in the United Kingdom. In addition to which, the arms trade operates in something of a legal parallel universe, and I'd ask you to skim through the 555 pages of examples in the Shadow World book and look at some of the documentary evidence of this, which is provided in over 2,800 footnotes. And when I say that the trade in weapons operates in a legal environment of impunity, that's shown first by a calculation we did with a group of researchers at the University of British Columbia in Canada that showed that of 502 violations of UN arms embargoes, and this is going all the way back to 2011, only 2 led to any form of legal accountability. Only 1 led to a prosecution, and that led to a fine that the arms dealer involved laughingly described to me as being less than pocket change by comparison to the $158 million profit he'd made on breaking 2 arms embargoes in 1 transaction. The trade in weapons accounts for 40% of all corruption in all world trade.
Oh.
I am not aware of a meaningful conviction for corruption, bribery, or fraud in an arms deal anywhere in the world. And part of the reason for this absurd situation is that not just in the UK, but in all of the arms producing countries of the world, the weapons making companies and the state have symbiotic relationships and are intertwined. I think it was Andy, you who mentioned the revolving door, the movement of individuals between the government in its broadest sense, the military, and these defense companies. We also see a situation where the most senior political individuals do things in office and are rewarded post-leaving office either by very lucrative appointments to these company boards or through consulting contracts with these companies or countries that are worth sometimes tens of millions of pounds. We see many former politicians occupying very senior positions on the board of many of these companies. And then, of course, there's the confused roles in policy formulation around these areas. And this is one of the things I would say that we need to be extremely alert two when it comes to autonomous weapons is who is actually involved in policy formulation and what economic interests do they have in the development of AI weaponry. Of course, a key role of intermediaries in arms deals is the laundering of the criminal proceeds of these deals, of the massive bribes that are paid on most arms deals that take place in the world today. So that the arms trade is in effect almost a subset of the illicit financial flows industry, if you will, that we have. We have recently been investigating what is described as state capture, the capture of the very highest office of state, the presidency, or 10 Downing Street as it would be in the UK. We've just been doing a huge amount of work with the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into State Capture in South Africa, where President Jacob Zuma and his business associates stole 1/3 of the country's GDP over every year during his 8 years in office. And one of the most terrifying things that we presented in our over 7,000 pages of evidence to the Zondo Commission of Inquiry is the money laundering network that was used to launder, we found $58 billion, but we suspect it is far more than that, involving a number of the biggest banks in the world, including Britain's biggest bank. And this is a money laundering network that, despite what has happened in South African state capture and despite Interpol Red Notice arrests for the Gupta brothers who were behind most of this with President Zuma and his family, this money laundering network continues apace and completely untroubled by the revelations. Now, obviously, when one puts these sorts of financial flows into bed with an industry that plays such a profound role in global corruption and financial and other malfeasance, we have an extremely serious situation. Now, given that my time is up, I would like to make just one more comment, and that is that when looking at investment decisions in defense companies, when looking at investment decisions in companies that are at the forefront of AI technology, I would argue that it is not just for ethical reasons that one should be concerned about such investments, and obviously one should, but also for financial and legal reasons. We've, for instance, over the past year in the United Kingdom, seen sustained direct action by a group called Palestine Action against Elbit Systems Limited, one of Israel's biggest weapons makers that had 9 production facilities in the United Kingdom. One of those production facilities has been forced to close down. This direct action against the company, and I think we're seeing just the beginning of strategies of direct action against such companies. It is estimated to have cost the company, before they announced the decision to sell one of the production facilities, around £15 million. So the risk is not just the ethical risk, but the risk is also that action taken against these companies is going to impact financial performance in the medium to long term. And in conclusion, let me say that I think, as the task force, which does such exemplary work, has been stating, the key weapons that we have in our armory to confront this sort of malfeasance are, of course, interrelated transparency and accountability. And as Natalie has so articulately put, in the United Kingdom, let alone the world, it is not a great time for either at the moment. And I think one of the things that was very briefly mentioned that we perhaps want to come back to is the crucial role of whistleblowers and the need for far greater protection for whistleblowers in the UK and many countries of the world. And finally, just to say, we clearly have a great deal of work to do, but thank you for being a driver of that work.
Oh, Andrew, thank you very much indeed. This is very, very powerful stuff. Very, very powerful stuff. We're going to be opening it up right up to questions in just a second. Before we do, let's please show our appreciation to Andrew. That was very, very powerful. Very, very powerful indeed. It'd be great to have you back and speaking when we've got more time, Andrew, because you've clearly got some tremendous insights that we really want to tap into. Okay, we'll be keeping this session open until just before 2 o'clock. We've got lots of people who want to share their thoughts, which is great, and let's keep that coming. We'll go to Chandler first of all, then to Lord Brown, then to Michaela in Canada, if I remember rightly, Michaela. Chandler, to yourself, please, first. Chandler, thank you.
Well, thanks very much. Just really, and perhaps it's an obvious one for both Baroness Bennett and Lord Brown. You have the SFO, you have the National Crimes Agents, Economic Crimes Agency, you have SOCA, you have a number of disparate statutory instruments that are available. But if we look at what happens in America in terms of SEC prosecutions, we don't appear, okay, the Rolls-Royce fine, etc. We don't really appear to be able to, A, resource an investigation, number one. And number two, if you then take the process of redress, or if you as an individual are affected by anything of this description, whether it be the London Capital Finance, the bond issuance with the FCA, you are essentially stranded from any form of redress, number one. Number two, is it not the case that at some point we would require, if you take the aspect of whistleblowers, if you take the aspect of nobody went to jail for the dodginess that took place in 2008, 2009, no bank CEO, anyone went anywhere near a magistrate's court, is it not the case that now that we have to have some form of change in legislation that makes individuals that run senior financial institutions either personally or publicly liable for breaches of corporate or fiduciary duty? I just want to know what your thoughts are, because ultimately with organizations like the TTF doing its best to raise the spectre of, you know, anything goes provided you're on the right side of the law and that you can pay for it, how do you actually lance this boil? Because, you know, people grow older and are disenfranchised every single day.
Thank you, Chandler. Well put question. Natalie, any comments from you first of all on that, and then we'll jump to Lord Brown. Thank you.
Well, I think that's really interesting, because what you're essentially talking about is vicarious liability, and that's something I engage with in another context, which is, this will sound very distant when I first start talking about it, but driven grouse shooting laws, there's a great deal of wildlife crime, particularly persecution of raptors on it. And Scotland has actually brought in vicarious liability for the owners of estates that, you know, if anyone is caught, which is, it very rarely happens with a raptor persecution case because it happens in the moors, but when someone's caught, it's invariably some quite low-paid gamekeeper who, you know, takes the rap and gets the fine. But Scotland has said that the landowner, the person who runs the estate, is actually responsible for that and can lose their license to run game shoots, can suffer penalties for that. And I think that's a really interesting example, is, you know, people who are getting, in many cases, great rewards from being in what we might often describe as positions of responsibilities in ordinary everyday language. I'd be very interested. I haven't really seen, and, you know, I cover many areas, but I haven't really seen any serious efforts in that direction. But I'd certainly be interested in hearing anyone who's working on that, because, you know, we do have this problem whereby, and, you know, dare I say it, quite a few of them sit in the House of Lords, usually across from me, and I look at them quite regularly. People who've, you know, been in positions of responsibility in places where things have gone horribly wrong, and they've paid no penalty for that. And I think, you know, we have to look at a situation where that is worked through, and the financial sector is a very obvious place to do that. And we do have this sort of legal model of a case study to start with.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Let's obviously pick up on that. That's a really, really excellent line of thought. Thank you. Lord Brown, if we could invite you to respond to the point that Chandler made. And then please also, you may have noticed in the chat, Lord Brown, that Mahara has put a question to you as well. I can see Andrew Feinstein's wanted to come in on something else as well, but we'll come back to you, Andrew, after we've got to Michaela and then Tanielle. Okay, thank you very much for everyone's patience. Lord Brown, your thoughts, please. Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, first of all, excuse me. First of all, can I just join everybody else in congratulating you and the others who have all spoken in this enormously rich conversation? I mean, I have pages of notes here.
Wow.
So there's just a couple of things that I mean, I think Chandler's question is easy to answer. The answer is yes. I mean, there is no question. I mean, ironically, this is the opposite of you know, of what's happening in Scotland, where businesses have to take responsibility for what individuals do. And generally, you know, businesses, when they're sued for negligence or whatever, try to avoid that vicarious responsibility for people. They try to distance those people from them. Whereas what happens in fraud or money laundering or in these areas is that they want the business to take the responsibility to protect the individual so that they can go on and continue to, you know, perpetuate malpractice and other things in other parts of the financial structure, you know. So because no individual, and these are high-level individuals as opposed to people who are sitting, you know, in clerks positions in businesses. These people, whatever happens, will use the corporate sort of veil to protect them from getting, and we need to break that. There's no question about that, because as Kevin Holmrich explained to us before, in health and safety, that's the only way in which you get people to take responsibility for the health and safety of their employees if they go to jail and the company doesn't get fined something they can afford anyway. So I'm absolutely in favour of that. It's a very difficult thing to do for the reason that the question that you yourself asked, Andy, is responsible for. There is no question that this kleptocracy has corrupted our democracy. I mean, there's plenty of examples of this. There are plenty of lines. You know, I mean, where do we want to start? I mean, I'm not maligning this particular individual, but you know, the Prime Minister's advisor on the, you know, the ministerial code, you know, is a man who's a very leading light in one of the country's biggest financial investment houses in the world, a business called Schroders. Now, I'm not saying that they are responsible for any of this, but there is a revolving door between the City of London and particularly financial institutions in the very heart of our government. People come in and out. So it's no wonder there's a kind of reluctance, because these people have extraordinary power, not only in the financial environment, but they have it in the heart of government. Right now, I mean, whether they're responsible for this or not, you know, the conversations that are taking place in the heart of government are responsible for the fact that the Russia report, you know, which identified a corrupting of our government by Russian money on behalf of the Kremlin, has not been implemented 18 months after it was published. And it took about 18 months to get the damn thing published in the first place. So, you know, there are clearly people who are influencing these decisions, who have the interests of, you know, our financial institutions and the way they operate, who are affecting government decisions, and they have probably affected the conversations that made the decision about the economic crime bill not being published. And hopefully, you know, there will be questions. I myself have today tabled a question, hopefully, that will be asked on Thursday. I haven't discovered if I've been successful, but there's a PNQ in the House of Lords that today that's going to be asked that can, you know, will allow somebody the opportunity to put that question to a government minister. But you don't always get such a refreshing honesty from government ministers as we got from one yesterday in the House of Lords. So I suspect that, you know, that we'll just be told to wait, that it's still in the mix. But really at the heart of our democracies across the world, there is the influence of kleptocracy, autocracy and populism. And this combination is rotting away democracies across the world and has already destroyed, you know, the democratic governments of many countries in the world. It is polluting the way, this combination is polluting the way in which we work. But I just want to take this all to the question that Daniel asked us, really, which was, how are we going to deal with this specific issue of lethal autonomous weapon systems and the creeping possibility that they will be developed and used, you know, by UK forces. I mean, broadly, in my view, contrary to what the military leadership want. I mean, the military leadership aren't desperate about these weapon systems, but there are people who are so awestruck by their capability that they want them, and they will take them no matter what the risk is. These people are not all malicious, but they just are awestruck by what the capability of this. And if you listen to the way people in the military talk about these weapon systems, some of them, and how people who were in the military talked about them recently, they solve a big problem for them, because they solve the responsibility of decision making and its effect on individuals, and the way in which it blows back on governments and leaders because of a duty of care. They can ask machines to do all sorts of things because they don't have to bring them back in body bags, and then have the responsibility for the decisions that they made with them thereafter. And there is no proper legal accountability for what they program these machines to do. And if we don't, and we'll never get that, because actually these machines have this capability that we've never had before, which is they have approximating to a kind of independence of thought. You know, and the ability to go on and do something, even if the circumstances would not wish the people who own them to do it. So this is really important. And the key to this, in my view, is to get senior ministers to take responsibility for these weapon systems. Not to do as they're presently doing, which is avoiding coming to Parliament, sending junior ministers to snow us with answers that don't mean anything, but senior ministers to come, secretaries of state, the Prime Minister himself, to say, I'm taking responsibility for this on behalf of the United Kingdom, and I'm making an ethical decision on behalf of the United Kingdom to deploy these weapons. Now, they will not do that. If we force them to the point of doing that, and that's my campaign, is to constantly keep saying this, and I'm astonished, I have to say, that when I do this in Parliament, the amount of cross-party support that I get, and no pushback at all from any parliamentarian. So we just need to get ministers to own up, just like the point that Chandela, once you get people to take responsibility for the consequences of what they're doing, then they start to think about it. But as long as they can distance themselves from it, and it can just be something that's happening, then they're not going to do that. And that's what we need to do. And we need all of your help to do that. We need to get this home to individuals, so that, you know, when people go for election, you can instruct their electors to ask them questions and say, why did you vote to support this? You know, and that's what terrifies politicians in the United Kingdom at the moment about what some of them have done with their votes. They're going back into their constituencies and people are saying to them, explain yourself. Why are you supporting this man and doing this? Why did you vote for this? So we need to get it to that point, and that's the point at which we will get politicians to take ownership. Sorry, somebody got a question in the chat. I can't see it. What is the question?
Yeah, I'll read it out. Let me get to it. So it's a question from Maihara, and the question is, in light of this permissive environment in which illicit money can easily enter the financial sector, and the prospects of these funds facilitating the development of harmful technology, including lethal autonomous weapons, what role can the UK Parliament have in ensuring that both these financial flows and the development of dual-use AI technology are better regulated domestically and internationally?
Yeah, well, we can only really do this by outlawing these weapon systems. If we outlaw these weapon systems, then we can criminalise the investment in them. But we need to outlaw the weapon systems first of all. If there's tacit permission from the government to allow these weapon systems to be developed, money will go where it can make money. Right? And it's very difficult to criticise people who take your and my money and our pensions and other things and invest them where it can get returns. Absolutely. If it is legal. We need to make it illegal first of all, and that's what we need to do. We need to go back to you know, what many people in this call have been trying to do, which is to get us to follow the overwhelming view that the world has that these weapon systems need to be outlawed. And we need to get into a leadership role in this, because when we were in a leadership role with other weapon systems, we managed to do it with, you know, with cluster munitions and with you know, anti-personnel landmines. We managed to do it. That's where we need to be. We might need to change the government to get it, but that will not stop many of us from campaigning for it in the meantime.
Lord Brown, you've made a huge contribution to the conversation just now. Can we all just show our appreciation to Lord Brown for his efforts, not just today, but also everything he's doing behind the scenes? And you can pick up the sense of authenticity in his passion for making change happen. We're going to go to Michaela. Michaela's in Canada. Michaela, if you can please be as succinct as possible, then we'll go to Tanielle, and then we'll open it right up for anybody else. Then we'll start bringing things to a comfortable close. Michaela,
all right.
thank you.
I'll talk very fast. like an MP. Now I know MP, they have a limited time, so they have to fit many ideas. So first point, it's about the money laundering and the secrecy in property owning. And it just happens that I read that article from the New Yorker about Rittenhurst, the largest property in London. And the journalists have a huge problem to determine the chain of ownership. And then there are these companies that are hidden, and you don't know who is it actually. It's they are Putin's people, but there are people that are in and out of favor. So it's everything. It's so that is a problem. And how do you go after these people, right? You don't want to be killed as a spy, right? By the Russian mafia. Then we talked about COVID and the spending and fraud. Well, much of it is also its incompetency. They threw money at everyone because of they were afraid of you know, how much do you know? How much is enough if you don't do enough? The problem is that the goal is not helping the people, as Natalie said. The goal is to get elected or re-elected, and that's the problem with the politicians. So especially here in Canada or even the States, you play it by the ear. You look at the polls, you say, oh, I have to do a bit more, throw a bit more money. So that's a problem. With the AI weapons, it's very well, it had been a solution. Again, looked at politicians wanting to be re-elected, didn't look good to bring home soldiers in body bags. So for the moment, it solved that problem. Now, of course, you cannot blame it on the computer, and it has to be the chain of responsibilities. And because, you know, the computer does what you tell it to do, right? So,
Michaela, thank you very much indeed. We'll help. Michaela,
okay, just one thing, it's about the SEC and inactivity of SEC. It's again a question.
Just quickly, please, Michaela, thank you.
All right.
No, I'm just saying, just make your point quickly. Thank you very much.
Ah, okay, I thought I'm off. Okay, so, well, talking about revolving doors, I might observe that it's not even needed to leave office. Actually, there are people that are following portfolio a la Nancy Pelosi and Dianne Feinstein. These are Democrats in California, which are some of the richest people. So they come into jobs, whatever, with declared richness. And then a few years later, on a declared salary, they are multimillionaires. So it's obviously they have lots of, how can I say, transactions, which are informed, right, from being.
Yeah, Michaela, forgive me interrupting you there partway through, but we'll grab it there. Thank you very much for your effort.
Thank you.
But that's super stuff as always. Andrew Feinstein, are you still with us? And if so, would you like to cover off the point you wanted to make earlier, and then we'll jump to Tanielle. Andrew?
I am, thanks very much. Just very briefly, on the Serious Fraud Office, the National Crime Agency, etc. I think the question there was an extremely important one. I just wanted to add to the response. I would suggest that we have serious systemic problems in relation to law enforcement in this country. And it becomes so much more apparent in the sorts of issues that we are looking at, where there are problems both of illegality not being properly investigated or prosecuted, and of loopholes enabling malfeasant behavior that might not actually be illegal. But in terms of the Serious Fraud Office, it is worth just mentioning that the Prime Minister at the time forced the Serious Fraud Office to close down the investigation into what was probably the most corrupt commercial transaction in history, the Al Yamama arms deal between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia, in which around £6 billion, and that's billion with a B, of bribes were paid. And initially the attempt was to close down the investigation, and they tried to get the SFO to claim that they didn't have sufficient evidence. And to the credit of the director and deputy director at the time, they refused to do that. So national security was invoked. And this is a very real problem. And as we come to look at autonomous weaponry, we must bear in mind that national security, which of course there are legitimate circumstances in which things have to be kept secret for reasons of national security and defense, but far, far too often, malfeasant behavior or a lack of legitimate and meaningful scrutiny is halted by invoking of the secrecy around national security. And we must be very, very cautious to work and lobby very strongly against that. And then I would say that the revolving door that we've spoken about in relation to the arms industry generally and government becomes a problem in law enforcement as well. I mean, I'm sure some of you are aware that the current director of the Serious Fraud Office was also appointed as the monitor for HSBC in her previous professional incarnation. Yeah. Now, is somebody who has benefited from HSBC as their anti-bribery monitor in an appropriate position to be able to decide whether to investigate and prosecute that same institution or organization? So I think that there is a very, very real issue here. And it's a pity that Ian Foxley has now left us, because he was one of the whistleblowers on the GPT case that has been mentioned in the chat. And I think this court case and this prosecution is a huge test for British law enforcement and the courts, because the corruption in GPT, which is a case that we've investigated thoroughly and written about, is overwhelming. And if we see yet another failure to prosecute massive bribery and corruption in an arms transaction between a British entity and the Saudi government again, I think that we have to raise very serious red flags about why our institutions are no longer fit for purpose.
Once again, Andrew, you've provided remarkably compelling and incisive input. You really have. There's so much in this topic, folks. We really do need to revisit it, perhaps in 3, 4, 5, 6 months' time. Clearly, there's enormous interest in it. Thanks, Andrew. Thank you. I'm going to invite Tanielle and then Ben from United Nations Association UK for their sort of closing remarks. And then we'll finish at just before 2 o'clock. Tanielle, what would you like to share? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all the speakers who were phenomenal, and actually the really important and useful interventions and provocative questions. It's really been one of the most useful events that I've been a part of in a really long time. I wanted to pick up on a few points. One that was just raised around the sort of national security argument, and why, while in some senses valid, it's a particular concern with this technology. And that is because for the first time in history, this is a technology where the military is not the leader here. It's actually led by the commercial industries, and the military is behind. The reason that's both of our benefit as campaigners, because as has been said just by Lord Brown, vastly the feeling is we don't want to participate in this, you don't understand how problematic the technology is, it's an ethical concern, there is no chain of command and accountability, and are you willing to say that you are accountable to any mistakes? Well, there are already mistakes in the military. There are mistakes with drones, there are mistakes when someone's on the end of a rifle. These are the kinds of mistakes that are purely down to the very nature of the technology, not we can improve the technology, the very design of complex systems. One of the very problems is that you could assign a threshold to this technology and have a kind of best practice community decision around what best practice would look like, but then never really share your data which could be illegally scraped, by the way, and a violation of privacy and human rights laws before you actually build the technology, data which no state would ever share with each other for obvious reasons. But the threshold, say an action threshold, you may have your data parameters which designs your technology, and let's say you have an action threshold which is just move forward, not even strike, but just a forward action, and let's say that action threshold is 70%, for argument's sake. the way that I have built my machine and the way that Andy has built his machine, my 70% and his 70% could look extremely different, because the way that that machine is built, what that 70% means could mean something wildly different. So best practice is somewhat futile and meaningless. So what you really need is law, as Lord Brown says, and others have commented, that actually makes decisions around what is applicable and what you can use that technology for. Now, onto fiduciary responsibility and the points that Andrew made, it's not just around the ethics. And one of the reasons that I've worked in economic law and divestment for a long time is to really get asset managers to see the writing on the wall. And they don't want to get involved in the kind of risk where they're going to lose money. Obviously, you hedge bets and you use risk so you can make money. But there is a fiduciary responsibility where asset managers can actually be liable for predictable losses. Now, what we're seeing in the world that I work in is that where asset managers are actually involved in harms, for example, human rights abuses, their investors are waiting for the outcomes of cases and they are ready to sue. And we're actually seeing that, and I could quote cases. So not just actions and PR and lack of popularity and CSR and the kind of moving of political and social tides. There are actually cases where investors, for their own reasons, because of predictable losses, are suing asset managers. So the sensitivities are changing. Finally, I just wanted to make the point that the dual use nature is very important in the sense that there could be the illegal uses, but then the manipulation of what is a legal use. And that's where, again, I think we need to look at the rating agencies. And that's really significant, because overwhelmingly the scientists, the student researchers who are raising their voices, who are campaigning at their universities, who are saying, I will leave my university, I won't give you my funding, I won't be a part of this technology, are saying, I do not want my research to be part of this. And what we've heard from the government in an evasive, and I would say a mendacious way, but also in a deeply lack of understanding way, is we don't want to restrict this positive technology. Now, I just want to quickly say two things to that. We have a legacy of protecting pure science and regulating technology so that the best of it can be protected. We have it in stem cell research, we have it in DNA, we had it with blinding lasers, which have been banned, we have laser eye surgery. Overwhelmingly, scientists were appalled by the fact that people in law enforcement, in border control, in war, civilians and combatants could be instantly blinded, but we have laser eye surgery. So the pure science was protected by the regulation, by the legislation. Scientists, tech workers should not have to be conscientious objectors. They are not lawyers. It is not for them to prevaricate, second guess, and pull back from the research they are doing because they are scared that it will fall into the wrong hands once they make a sale of their technology, and it then becomes used for something it was not designed for, it was not intended for. So there are two aspects. Rating agencies need the kinds of experts who know what they're looking for, who can actually create a new classification, and then the law, as Lord Brown just said, needs to be able to protect that both domestically and internationally, so it can make it a crime with international criminal law, humanitarian law, and human rights law. And as Baroness Bennett said, we really need accountability so that you are not creating incentives so that people can create laws or prevent laws being created for their own personal interest. That is not democracy. That is not really what finance should be for, which is funding the real kind of social securities and interests of this country rather than personal interest. And I will leave it there. And thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Tanielle, for that and for inspiring this whole event in the very, very first place. Thanks ever so much, Tanielle. We'll go to Ben at United Nations Association UK for any final thoughts he may have to share with us, and then we'll bring things to a close. But please do understand, everybody, today's event isn't just an event in isolation. It's a serious, thought-through attempt to galvanise support for co-creating solutions that need to be found for problems we've been talking about. So please do get involved with what we're planning to do, and we'll make that all clear when we follow up with emails tomorrow. Ben, any final comments from yourself, sir? Thank you.
Just one last massive thank you to every one of our really inspiring speakers. I think they're two such complex issues, the issue of emerging tech and the issue of accountability in financial structures, and they've been brought together amazingly. So I want to thank everyone for raising this up the agenda, and look forward to staying in touch. So thank you very much, and thanks for putting this together, Andy.
It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you, Ben, and Tanielle and Mayara. It's been a real pleasure in recent months, and I can't wait to organise the next one. We can do all that together. Thanks, folks. Let's give ourselves a round of applause, everybody, because we've all contributed to being part of the solution by talking about the problems that are most definitely out there. Thanks, folks. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy.
Welcome. See you guys. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you, all the speakers, Andrew, Baroness Bennett. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.